Hello everyone, so today we are talking about transmission of pathogens, so how they spread from one to another. I'm going to try and point out as well lots of extra bits where you could do some extra research if you want to, because there's lots of topics where this could relate to the coronavirus or other diseases that people just find interesting. Also, I am very aware that some of my lessons are getting a little bit long and I'm only supposed to be setting you 45 minutes worth of work at a time. So talking about transitions of disease is just developing what we already know, really. So thinking first of all about the life cycle of a pathogen. So pathogenic life cycles involve having to have a host at some point, basically. That's why they're a pathogen. They wouldn't be a pathogen if they weren't infecting other people. So they have to be able to travel from one host to another. Now, it doesn't mean direct transmission in terms of it has to be physical contact, but they have to have some mode of transmission from one host to another. They need to be able to actually enter the tissues of the host, not necessarily the cells, but the tissues. They need to be able to reproduce in the host, and they need to be able to leave the host if necessary to move on to another host or surface. Now, I've included a picture in the bottom right hand side which actually shows the life cycle of malaria. Malaria is one way, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, that you could actually go and look at their life cycle in a bit more detail, because it's very interesting where it has symbiotic relationships and where it has parasitic relationships. And if you notice, this is Plasmodium falciparum, which is the worst kind of malaria, so you can see that there if you want to enlarge it and look at it in more detail. So just going through a few direct transmission sources. Now, this is something you would have covered at GCSE, but perhaps just a bit more detail, and you don't need to know all the different methods because we kind of squeeze them together. So talking firstly about direct physical contact or touching. Touching a person or touching a surface that has been contaminated with a disease. In order to prevent this, we could say use condoms. So before, probably in GCSE, you would have called that maybe like bodily fluids, but you know, that is essentially because some sort of fluid is touching you that has the disease and it comes from a person. So using condoms for any form of sexual intercourse, so that's not just, that includes oral sex basically as well. Clean any cuts that you have regularly, and just generally clean. Wash your hands and surfaces down to avoid it. Examples of things that travel quite strongly through direct transmission, physical contact, are HIV, meningitis, ringworm, and athlete's foot. The next one, fecal oral contamination. So basically this tends to be water, food, or drink that has been contaminated by a pathogen in some way. So classically, we have very few cases of diseases caused by this in this country because we have very good food hygiene laws and standards. We have very good water systems that clean our water so that nothing bad happens. So, but it is more so underdeveloped countries. It essentially means that maybe that if you look at the rivers that in the picture, maybe an animal has like excreted into that area and they're using it as drinking water because they don't have a source of clean water. Food, or something as simple as like food's not been left out or stored in the right conditions, it's been contaminated and then not cooked properly. So how can we prevent this? Don't use human sewage as fertiliser. Now that seems really obvious and it's not something we do in this country, but some places do. So we all know what manure is, not being careful with our manure and fertilising our soil with essentially feces that could have diseases in them, and therefore that's getting into plants and therefore getting into our food. Treat wastewater to clean it, so pathogens and fecal contamination, that's obviously something that happens in this country. We don't have dirty drinking water. Everything that comes out of our taps, unless it says not drinking water, is safe. And obviously just cook your foods thoroughly. Cholera, dysentery and food poisoning are all examples of this. Cholera was one that was big a long time ago. I think you probably would have done it in history about the tap in London that spread cholera around a lot of people very quickly. Droplet infection, this is coughing and sneezing. So if we are thinking about COVID-19, for example, you would say that it spreads through a droplet infection. Or direct physical contact with surfaces or people that have been exposed to droplet infection. So droplets are normally not visible, but they are carried as moisture in the air. To prevent this, we simply need to cough or sneeze into a tissue or your hand, and then wash your hands or get rid of the tissue afterwards. And again, really, we could have wiping down surfaces that are contaminated by droplets that have been released. This is actually quite interesting when it talks about how different diseases have different sized droplets and therefore can travel different distances, and that's why you might have seen recently they were saying 2 meters apart, because that's how far the droplets can kind of form or transfer through COVID-19. But now there's actually some suggestions to say that it's actually far further than that, and that is just because we are learning more and more about that disease all the time, and that's why they update their information. So they're probably saying it went from being sort of one of these diseases to one of these diseases. Finally, the idea of spores, a bit more of an uncommon one, so it's important to know. So spores that are released by pathogens, so little parts of the pathogen release themselves, can be released into the air, into and through soils or on surfaces. So it just is like basically to do with the way they multiply. We can say that wearing masks is probably the best one for this kind of transmission, because we can't control, it's not when you're coughing or sneezing like a droplet, we can't control when that pathogen decides to do that. And lots of cleaning, washing, antibacterial, wiping, bleaching, etc. Anthrax and tetanus are examples of this, but although something we don't massively have a problem with in this country. Just want to talk about malaria quickly, because it's the most common example and the one you need to know about, which is transmitted through a vector. Now, yes, I have just copied this from the book because it's the simplest and easiest way to do it. So, malaria has a symbiotic relationship with the mosquito. It's the Anopheles mosquito, which is a female only. It doesn't affect the mosquito in any way. The mosquito doesn't get sick from it, but it does gain something from the mosquito. So mosquito neither here or there for the malaria, but malaria is gaining. It needs to be able to reproduce a certain part of its life cycle in malaria. So it says Plasmodium develops and migrates. So it's going through a developmentary part of its life cycle and migrates to the salivary glands, which is how it actually gets into the humans. It could not get into humans without the vector. Again, something it's getting from the vector. Once it's bitten, it goes into your blood. It will go to your blood cells in your liver, and like we said before, it feeds on hemoglobin and parts of your liver, which causes it to degenerate and make you quite sick. Now, malaria, as I kind of suggested yesterday, is a disease that is very bad. It kills lots of people around the world, and you should already know that. There's 4 different strains of it, and I did ask you, and I'm not going to tell you the answer just yet, but in case you haven't done it yet and you want to, that if you have something called sickle cell anemia, or you're a carrier of this in particular, it actually benefits you from not suffering from malaria. So see if you can find out for why. But like I said earlier, there's so much you could research on malaria, but you really just need to know a snapshot. So what do I want you to do? Number 1, answer the questions on the bottom of page 231, and then answer the questions in the Word document that I have attached and self-mark. At the end of the Word document, the mark scheme comes up. It's classic. If you're going to cheat, you're only cheating yourself. Do it by yourself if you can, and then green pen afterwards. I'm never going to know if you cheated, to be honest, so there's that. And then can you answer these 2 questions? How might climate change affect disease transmission, and why, and what conditions could heighten disease transmissions? Now, the reason why I'm asking you to do those is because you could answer them based on the book, or if you wanted to, you could do some extra research. Hopefully you all saw like the podcast links that I sent out yesterday. Some of those have got some really interesting talks about coronavirus and why it's come about. And actually I listened to a whole podcast a few weeks ago about how did the coronavirus basically start and be caused by climate change and the human rise in population, and why. So give that a listen. Thank you so much to everyone that is really fully engaging in these lessons. It's really nice that this is my class with the highest uptake and that you are all really enjoying the videos and just getting on. It's been really great to see, so well done. Any questions, please email me.